Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month.
So I'd like to welcome you to the Commonwealth Club, and I'm very humbled to welcome Natasha Lance-Rogoff, who I happen to know personally, to talk about her new book, Muppets in Moscow, The Unexpected, Crazy, True Story of Making Sesame Street in Russia. And I found this book to be, I'm sorry if the superlatives embarrass you, Natasha, but it is entertaining, scary, in places very darkly funny, romantic, and finally really uplifting when it demonstrates the artistry and the resilience of the Russian people. And it also gives you a peek behind the curtain, the Iron Curtain maybe, at a moment in Russian history that is sadly gone and it's replaced now by authoritarianism. So Natasha's mission and that of her parent Sesame Street Company was really very altruistic. It was to educate millions of ex-USSR children, now Russian, encouraging honesty, humor, kindness, and of course, racial tolerance. What could go wrong? Okay, so thank you, Natasha, for joining us today. And here is my first question. You were a student and filmmaker in the 80s in the pre-collapse USSR. Tell us how that came to be.
Well, first, I want to thank you for that overly generous introduction.
I meant every word of it. You know, it's awful when you have to read your friend's book and you don't like it. I loved this book, honestly.
And thanks so much to the Commonwealth Club and for everybody tonight for coming also. When Sesame Street tapped me to produce the original production of the iconic American show in Russia, it was really an unprecedented time. And the Soviet Union had just collapsed a few years earlier, and this is 1/7 of the world's surface, so huge, massive territory. And this included Central Asia, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, and it was really a period of incredible hope, excitement, but also pain and humiliation because they were a superpower.
And confusion, I would imagine, about who they are now and what to hold on to and what to let go of.
Nobody had any idea what the future would bring, and especially for their children.
Yeah. Okay, so talk about how you became fluent in Russian and how you studied there first, because it seems like that prepped you for being the kind of person they might have thought about to give this job to. You weren't just some Hollywood TV producer that were dropped it cold into this environment. You knew your way around, or so you thought.
Yeah. I mean, I thought I was the last person that should be doing this production.
Why?
Because I had no children's television experience.
Oh, there's that.
And I had spent 10 years in the Soviet Union previously, so I spoke Russian, having worked for television news and making really serious documentaries. And
but you were fluent, right?
I was fluent in Russian.
Yeah.
And then these two Sesame Street executives showed up at a screening of a documentary which was called Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism. And I had just come back after embedding myself with fascist communists who didn't want to see the Soviet empire fail, and they wanted to retain power. And so these Muppet guys come up to me and they're like, would you help us bring Sesame Street to Russia? And I said, did you guys just watch my film? I was completely confused. And then they just said, this was a wonderful guy, Gary Nell, who said, you can't, come on down to the headquarters. Nobody says no to Elmo.
Well, you didn't, did you? So I'd like you to set the stage for us, because when you were there before, it was the USSR, like you say, fascist and humorless, and here you are about to bring this sparkling children's program. What was different when you went back after you got the job? What did you walk into culturally?
Culturally, it was still very similar because it really had only been 2 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. So, it wasn't that dissimilar from what it had been before.
They hadn't shaken off the hangover.
They hadn't shaken off 70 years of communism
Correct.
overnight. Although you would think that, if you looked at this project in particular, was funding for it was spearheaded by Senator Biden, then Senator Biden. And so, the West was just evangelical about the collapse of communism. And
And they thought that was it? It was all going to be good now?
we were somewhat naive about, how long it would take, or if, at all possible for Russia to change. Now we're seeing
Speaking of
results
that naivete, that kind of leads into the next thing. The Henson Company, which is also Sesame Street, and they are lovely people. Both my husband and I have worked for them. And they're known for their cultural nuances when they had previously done a number of foreign Sesame Streets, and they didn't usually go in thinking they were just going to Xerox what they'd been doing in America. And in your book, it speaks about how they would really look at the history and culture and music and costumes and colors of these various places, and they had a really good reputation for being sensitive to those things. And yet, when you got there, it seemed like Russia was particularly insurmountable in this area. So if you could tell me, was it Western arrogance that everybody just thought it would be a cakewalk, or was there more naivete involved that sets the stage for your unbelievable Herculean struggle to get this done?
Well, Sesame Street has international co-productions all over the world, and they did then too. And as you said, the Henson Company, built the puppets for those international productions. And each of those productions, ideally, were supposed to reflect the values and culture of the different countries. So, for instance, in every Sesame Street international co-production has a neighborhood, and all the neighborhoods look different. So in South Africa, it's a marketplace. In Norway, it's a train station, their neighborhood. In the US, it's an urban environment that is, the idea for that was basically Harlem. So when, we went to create the Russian production, we used the same model that Sesame Street had used in all the different countries.
Successfully, correct?
Yeah,
They didn't get the amount of pushback that you were about to walk into.
No,
They-
this
no.
was probably one of the first productions, I think, that most of their productions were in Europe or in Mexico, where I had also worked and trained before I did the Russian production. But the challenges in this production were enormous. The cultural clashes, we faced. I know we're going to talk about this at some point, but we faced tremendous violence, with our sponsor. Our first sponsor of the show had his car blown up. And
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Okay, I won't
We'll
talk
get
about
to
that. Okay, but in terms of the culture, there were many areas that came up during the curriculum seminar, which is a 3-day workshop where we bring together child educators from all over the former Soviet Union and the creative team. And at this meeting, we are trying to decide what are we going to teach children of the post-communist era? What values, what scenarios are we going to write? How will these Muppets model new ideas? So when we did that, for instance, like I raised my hand and I said, we were in this discussion, and I said, what about a scenario where children would have run a lemonade stand? And the reaction to that was just horror. how they explained. They said, this would be shameful to have children selling things on the streets. The only people that sold things under communism on the street were criminals, because independent commerce was illegal. Making
Wow.
a profit was illegal.
Wow. Okay. You also got pushback about whether they even needed Muppets at all in Russia.
Yeah, we had we nearly had, I think, an international crisis over the Muppets, and the Russians. I say Russians, but we had, Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, everybody.
Sure.
But the creative team really, they didn't like the Henson style soft foam Muppets.
Fuzzy.
Yes. And when we first proposed the series, the head writer said, well, we want to use our own Muppets. We have a revered tradition dating back to the 16th century of puppetry. And
Okay, I have to stop you there for a second. So their thinking was, if it was good enough for Catherine the Great, it's good enough for my 4-year-old.
that is true.
Oh, God. And I think some of their actual nationally known puppets that had been on television were probably not something you wanted to pursue. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
They were damn depressing, these puppets.
No, the first.
If not scary.
Yeah, the first time, as they were arguing in favor of their own Muppets, so they had me meet with their chief puppet designer, and he walks in with 2 sacks, and he pulls out these puppets, and he starts, holding them up, and one puppet says to the other puppet, "I'm going to kill you," and this is all in Russian, and I'm sitting here thinking, this puppet on puppet violence is not very Sesame Street like. and the characters had, they were wooden, and they had really cruel expressions. So I thought, we're looking for something very different, something completely
Well, there was lots
original.
of centuries of things being a howling bummer, so I guess that just reflected that. Wasn't one of them a cannibal?
Oh, yeah, well, they... I love what she remembers.
Well, I read it over the last 2 days because I
Yes.
wanted to be fresh. So this is not like I read it a month ago. This is
Yeah.
burning in my brain right now.
Yeah, no,
Cannibal
at the-
Muppets. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Hensons will love that.
At the end of one of these very, very long meetings where, the whole table was covered with coffee cups and cookies and everything for hours trying to figure out what to do. And one of the people said they really wanted to have Baba Yaga as one of their Muppets. And that is a witch who eats children. So I was like, we have a long road to go here. But it wasn't only that. It was also the music director.
Oh, this is good.
Who was an accomplished pianist and a composer, and she insisted that the show only have classical music. And everybody knows, Sesame Street is known for its music, its diversity, its inventiveness in terms of the music. And also, I had lived in the Soviet Union, during this earlier period, and had made another film about underground rock and roll. And a lot of those musicians had been persecuted under communism. They weren't allowed to record their music, they weren't allowed to perform, and they couldn't make any money, earn a living from
And
their
if
music.
this woman had had her way, they would have stayed that way.
Right.
Yeah.
But
She was one of the more rigid and inflexible
quite-
characters that
Yeah, and another colleague called her the oldest 30-year-old I'd ever met in my life.
Right. Talk for a minute, though, because there is a lot of cultural pride, legitimate cultural pride that these people had, and possibly mistrust of the West because they'd been indoctrinated to think that for so many years, and now suddenly everything cracks open and they've got Pizza Hut and McDonald's, which they might have mixed feelings about, right? And now there's going to be adorable, clever little ditties like Rubber Ducky in Russian. admittedly, they did not use any of the same songs that we knew in America, but, there were arguably going to be new ones created that kids could actually sing. I don't see kids on the playground, singing Prokofiev. I mean, but this is what she thought, right?
Yeah, I know. Well, I understood where she was coming from. I mean, they had an incredibly long, rich tradition of music, and actually, most of their animated series for children used classical music, and they're beautiful. It's all cell animation, and we were lucky because the talent base of these incredibly talented people was very high. So we pulled people. Our team was about 400 puppeteers, artists, set designers, writers, producers, and directors. So at this time, the studios in Russia were black. There was no money to make films, and they were unemployed. And when I went back to Russia in January of 2020, and I met with the chief director, who's now in his 80s, and he told me something that he hadn't told me for 30 years, and he had played hard to get when I was trying to hire him, and telling me, oh, I'm doing another film right now and everything. And he told me in January that he hadn't worked in a year and a half, that he was incredibly worried about feeding his family. And when we offered him the job, it was like the greatest gift at that time. But it took him 30 years to tell me that.
Would you say that economic fear is one of the largest reasons why you were able to assemble this team? Did they want to? What percentage of them do you think actually wanted to help you bring Sesame Street to Russia? And what percentage of them initially, because I know this changed over time, just wanted the paycheck, which also didn't come right away, but we'll get to that.
I would say that was not a depiction of the team at all.
Really?
And that, after living under communism for that many years, people felt this incredible release and hope and passion about trying to create a better Russia, a different Russia. As they often referred to it, we want to create a normal country.
Oh,
and
that's very sad.
At the same time, they did have enormous pride, and rightfully so. I mean, Russia has made tremendous artistic contributions to the world. And what they did, I had worked in different countries. The experience that I had creating the Muppets, for example, with the Russians was like nothing at all. I mean, the discussion of what the color was going to be of the Muppets involved a multi-dimensional conversation about Kandinsky, Vasily Kandinsky. And the artist had written a treatise on the theory of color.
The meaning of color, yeah.
Right, which was it related to the emotions that different colors carry. So this had to be part of the discussion.
Because everybody was fluent in that.
Yes, everybody. And they looked at me when I said, what are you guys talking about? And they said, oh, yellow, you can't be yellow. That causes madness. And, and then they got to the red one and, makes children hyper. And I thought, wait a second, Elmo's red. He's like the most popular character. Mm-hmm. But, eventually they chose blue. And even that was a discussion because the word for blue in Russian, goluboy, means gay. So some of the people thought, people will think the puppet's gay. And I was like, puppets don't have a sexual identity. It's like,
oh, that's so funny. I'd like to back up a little bit because even though this is all stuff that I love, to when you've kind of just arrived there and you are told by corporate headquarters that one of your first tasks in this kind of unstable environment is to find a broadcasting partner. And I'd like you to discuss, this is the part of the book where I felt like Natasha was like Sisyphus, pushing this boulder up the hill only to have it roll down again and explode. So it's worse than Sisyphus. So if you could get into that a little bit, this was where I began to think I would not be woman enough to go through what you went through. And I'll ask you more about how you managed to persevere in the face of the things she's about to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, there were the environment after communism had fallen apart was very violent. So the center of the government was weak. And at this point, you had the Western bankers, investors flooding into the country, and there was enormous amount of money flowing into Russia at this time, and the oligarchs were starting to take over. So at this point, Sesame Street is a nonprofit, and we are looking for a sponsor for our show. So we finally found one in one of the oligarchs who decided that what we were doing was important. And we negotiated a deal. He was all in. And, he was sort of upset that Big Bird wasn't going to be in the show, but they were going to have their own original Muppets.
Bluebird.
Bluebird.
You did win on the blue thing after all. Gay Bluebird, yes.
Yeah. But anyway, he was his car was blown up in a car bombing, and he had severe burns over most of his body, and he had to leave
The country
immediately. And that was one deal that exploded. And then not less than a few months later, we did another broadcast deal. So this was now the second time we had done this. And that was with the head of Russia's largest television broadcaster. There were only 2 channels in Russia at this time. So they didn't have cable as we did in the US. There were a few tiny stations that were just starting. And that signal from the Russian station was sent across 11 time zones. So when we got the deal to do the broadcast, it was a big deal, and this was a wonderful man, Vlad Listyev, who was trying to bring freedom of expression, a free press to the TV station, and to battle corruption inside the television station related to advertising revenue. And when he went home to his house after leaving the TV station, he was shot on the steps of his home.
This is the moment where I want to ask you, at any point, if you were personally afraid for your own physical safety.
I wish I had been more. It's sort of like you're younger. You don't think, you sort of think you're close to it. But these 2 circumstances were probably the scariest moments for me. Other than one other moment that happened later. But
yeah,
it was just a little too close for comfort. And mostly I was just really sad because these were people that I had, become close to. They were my confidants. I trusted them, and they were going to help us. And
at no point was there ever an official explanation, of course, right?
To this day, that murder of Vlad Listyev has 120 judicial files in their police station, and it's still unsolved.
One of the things in Natasha's book that I found, in retrospect, typically Russian, is these unbelievably fraught things would happen and there would never be any explanation. And you would never really know who was behind it or why. I mean, it could have been the guy's mistress, or it could have been a complete political, hit job. And that's always scary when you don't know what you're dealing with or who's behind it. So this leads me to what I personally found, even though she was not physically present at the time, to be maybe the most scary incident. Those were awful, but this actually had to do with your offices.
Yeah. We had, so our office was inside the television station. This is the same station that I visited in January 2020, which was, surreal to be walking around the same place 30 years later, but now it was completely different. And we had all of our scripts and equipment, even a life-size Elmo that was our mascot in the office. And what happened is soldiers came in all of a sudden. They had AK-47s, and they took over the entire floor, and kicked everybody out of the offices and then took locks and sealed the lock on the offices and put wax on it and said, everybody, that's it, you're done. And of course, everything was in this office. And at this time, there are no computers. We didn't have, I mean, computers existed, of course, but we had very limited use of computers because most of the people, well, nearly 99.9% of the people we worked with had never used a computer before. So we had all of our written scripts and everything in this office, and that was pretty terrifying.
Okay, there are some slightly more lighthearted things I'm going to get to, but you had a glamorous female financial partner who professed great affection for you, but barely came through with offices or production money, and you never really knew what the deal was with her to this day, do you? I mean,
Irina
yes,
Borisova.
yes. She of the designer boots and fabulous hair, but like somehow it seemed like corporate headquarters had to bail you out a few times with cash infusions. She did finally come through with new offices.
Yes, no, she was amazing. She was the kind of person that, you know, she could get anybody to do anything. She was.
Including you.
Including me. Yes, she was coquettish and incredibly powerful at the same time. And yeah, she made my life hell, but at the same time I adored her. I mean, I know that her heart was in the right place, but it was very difficult to be a woman in the advertising and production business in Russia at that time. And for my team, I mean, we hired mostly women. So when I accepted the job with Sesame Street, I knew going in, you know, Russia is a very patriarchal, sexist society, and I had come from America as a film person, and it was also not easy. So I thought, okay, I can create the team that is, you know, more than 50% women. And so having a female partner and females in
help facilitate
key roles made it, you know, a really unusual production.
All right. Like you didn't have enough on your plate with all of these other things, and I'm going to get back to some of the creative things that you did in a minute, but you fell in love, got married, and got pregnant, all while trying to lift, like Atlas, the world on your shoulders. And after corporate headquarters agreed to step in with a cash infusion because Irina wasn't quite there yet, you know, because your people weren't getting paid, you became something that I have never before heard of, which is a lactating cash mule. Can you tell that story to these people? I was howling when I read it. I mean, I realized it was scary because you were going through customs, but people were literally, that wasn't easy ways to get money to Russia. You can talk about why that turned out to be that
I mean,
way.
there were no Western banks in Russia at this time. And it was impossible unless you establish yourself as an entity legally in the country. But also, if you sent money to Russia, it was your dollars were immediately converted to rubles, and the ruble was devaluating like 25% each month. It
would be meaningless in a month.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't run a production like that.
Right.
So, you know, we had to come up with other ways to do this, and there were a lot of discussions around this. But in one, you know, everything we did was completely legal, and, you know, at one point I had to carry, you know, the less than the legal amount of $10,000. And of course I had a double D size bra because I was pregnant. And I could, anyway, there's ample room for the cash is all I can say.
Well, it's a good thing none of the customs people tried to cop a feel because you would still be in a Russian jail. That just slayed me, you know. It's funny now because she got through. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the creative pushback and difficulties, but can you talk about a couple of major creative turning points you had where these people start to come together, understand each other better, understand you better. There's a point where it started to actually gel. And it was a long time coming, too. There was a lot of pushback. Some people quit because they didn't get their miserable, sad Russian music or other reasons. So tell me.
That case, if you take the music, for instance, the woman who was dead set against modern sounds, she met with one of my friends who had become a rock and roll star later. And, she was scared to meet this guy. I mean, he wore leather pants, he had an earring. This was terrifying for her from where she was from, having been educated in the Moscow Conservatory. But she came back from this meeting like a changed woman. They found commonality. They had children the same age. And from that point on, he explained to her that, he could also write music for children. And this, guy ended up writing some of the best songs for the show. And the pianist, the music director, was able to change her attitudes and accept bringing in all kinds of young music artists. And another example of this is, for instance, when we were discussing inclusivity.
Oh, this is good.
And, this was at the 3-day curriculum seminar with all the education experts. And we showed a clip of from the Sesame Street American show to give them an idea of, how tolerance can be addressed. And in this clip, there's a little boy in a wheelchair, and he's with a friend, and he's flying a kite. And in the background, there's this upbeat song, me in my chair, we go everywhere. And I'm watching the clip and smiling, and the video ends, and I look at the group, and they're just looking at this, at me and the TV, and they just say, how can you do that? It's so exploitative to show children in a wheelchair. And then another woman says, why would normalni dzieci, normal children, ever want to watch a TV show with nenormalni dzieci? And she's saying it like just innocently. And I'm sitting here listening to these, enlightened educators and thinking to myself, maybe they're not ready for Sesame Street. Maybe this is just a really bad idea. And, this is kind of disheartening because I'd already been through, previous discussions, how they didn't want our Muppets. And, there were all kinds of other challenges related to this besides the classical music. And then, one woman says, you Americans don't understand that our children will never have wheelchairs, that our country, is falling apart, that our healthcare system has collapsed. So we have children who are trapped in their beds. And if you have children who have wheelchairs in the TV show, how will these children trapped in their beds feel? They'll just be sad.
Wow. That's intense.
So it was intense. But then, it goes on from there because as the debate continues about how to handle this, because these educators feel a sense of responsibility. They're making a show for millions of children, and they want to change the country, but they're not sure how. And, one guy said, he was a physicist, and he said, you're tasking us with coming up with a TV show that can teach children and model for children values to help them thrive in a new open society. But we don't know what a new open society looks like.
Wow. And could you speak to the racial inclusivity part? Because that I think was one of your triumphs, actually.
You mean?
Well, the various different racial, like they didn't want, like, I can't remember whether it was Ukrainians or like they wanted, it was because of all the different types of Russians that they are and different racial and societal.
Yeah, no. That's a really good question. So during this particular seminar, it was very difficult because there was an attack in Budenovsk, which was Chechens were taking over a Russian town. And it was one of the first attacks where you had post-Soviet brothers fighting against each other.
Yeah.
And so there was enormous feeling of hostility towards the Chechens and Central Asia. So, our goal was to create a TV show that would appeal to all children of the former Soviet Union, and there were over 123 nationalities
That's where I was
in the former
interested
Soviet
in
Union.
how you managed to do that.
And so, there was this experience that went over several days while we were having this discussion with the educators. Took enormous strength, and I'd say tolerance on the part of the people in the workshop, because they had to come over their feelings of incredible anger in order to think of the bigger issue of educating everybody.
And they did.
And they did. Yeah.
But I guess the Chechen Muppet was out. You weren't going to make one of those.
No Chechen Muppet.
Okay. I want to know, can you just come up with one example of a moment you really felt you turned the corner? Was that what we were just discussing, or is there another one we haven't discussed where you suddenly, after pushing the boulder?
I would say, okay, so just continuing on this theme of inclusivity. So I didn't really finish that story, but what ended up happening is that there was a woman in the back of the room who suddenly spoke up, and she said, my name is Ludmila, and I'm from Chuvashia, which is a small region in western Russia, which extends from the Volga to Siberia. And our town was used as a dumping ground for hazardous chemicals during the communist era, so we had the highest rate of deformities of children. So as she's talking to the group, and they're still trying to debate this issue of inclusivity, and she says, I work with these children every day. I play with them, I laugh with them, and they yearn to play with normal children. She used the word normal.
And she was heard by the others. They heard her.
I watched her speaking, and then she pleaded with them, why can't you write scenarios for these children that show them as human and valuable to the society? And the guys who had spoken earlier, who said, you can't show children in wheelchairs, and they're all sitting there, shifting in their seats uncomfortably. And then I look around the room, and I see that a couple of people are crying. And this is humiliating for them. And you have Americans that are sitting in that meeting with them as well.
Were you crying too?
I was crying too, and I was trying to hide it, because I'm the one who's supposed to be in charge.
I'm starting now.
Yeah. And it was really, an incredible moment, because I didn't need to say anything. The Americans just sat there, and this group...
They said it to each other.
They said it to each other, and they saw... it was like she was like an angel, descending into the room.
Into the chaos.
Yeah. And then everybody just, came to this conclusion that together that they had to do this. They had a sense of their responsibility.
I want to know something that doesn't have to do with an angel coming down, although it does sound like that's what it was. Why were you able in the end to succeed? I mean, this seemed like an insurmountable. The more you read this book, and, it's got lots of freakish humor in it, and it's very engaging, but I would have packed up and gone home week 2. Why were you able to succeed? I think that they could have sent 99 other people, and they would have washed out. Was it your love of the culture? Was it your respect for the creative process? Tell me why you think in the end you were able to succeed. Because she did succeed. The show did get made. It did become a huge hit from the day it first aired, and it was on the air for years even after she left. we all know the end of the story, but I'm very interested in what you think you were able to pull out of yourself that made you, with the assassinations and the AK-47s in the office and these tremendous clashes of all of these creative egos. Why do you think you succeeded?
I think it was very much about the people that I was working with, and seeing the sacrifices that they were willing to make, and the incredible hope after living under communism for so many years, that, you know, the idea that it was possible that this country, this vast country, could change was, you know, incredibly seductive. And the ambition that Sesame Street, you know, as a nonprofit, the risks that the company was willing to take, it was phenomenal. I mean, most companies would have walked out at that point.
And these people knew that you cared about and respected them.
I did love them.
Yeah.
And, you know, and also people were dying. I mean, there are people that were, you know, you work with them every day, and suddenly, you know, they're just murdered. And this didn't, you know, I didn't even talk about the third person who was also murdered.
Oh my God.
That was the third broadcaster. And, you know, the 2 weeks before, I had given him a Tickle Me Elmo doll, and he had a picture of his 8-year-old daughter on his table, and we talked about that. And he was this kind of buff, attractive guy who like hugged me, which is when he first met me, which is kind of unusual. You know, they usually have a little more distance with Russians. And this guy, you know, was also murdered.
And no explanation.
And no explanation. To this day,
Again.
I can show you. I mean, there's a picture of him in the book. But, you know, when you're in that environment and then you go home, you know, I go back home to my fiance, who then became my husband, and, you know, and you're in America, and it's you know, peaceful by comparison and stable and has had 200 years of democracy. So you go back and you go out to dinner with friends, and they're talking about, you know, pasta and real estate. And then you go back to Moscow, and you're in this intense environment where, you know, there's the possibility of creating a totally different future, and to give, you know, children something that can help them, you know, move into a more open society. So, I mean, being part of that for me was a gift, and it was nothing like making documentaries.
And it overcame the fear.
It overcame the fear. I mean, I definitely was afraid. I wouldn't say overcame the fear. There were many times when I was afraid. And I just, you know, I had excellent team. I had a very close partner, Leonid Zygalski, who from Moscow. And
you did have a very close friend who had your back.
Yeah, and I was working with, you know.
But Natasha, I have to stop you
Yeah.
because that was my last question. Why did you succeed? And we will now negate the possibility of anyone else asking you a question. So it's that time where we have to turn it over to the rabble. How did the office lockout resolve, and what were the challenges to making that happen? And revisiting the studio in 2020, what were the most meaningful comparisons and reflections for you? That's a pretty long question, so
I'll try and
I've got
answer
a
it
couple
quickly.
more, so
Sure.
do what you can.
Yeah. So the office takeover was not resolved. We lost everything, and we had to start from scratch again. And all the scriptwriters were working in their apartments for, I guess, about another 2.5 months. And there were no cell phones, so we couldn't call anybody. We couldn't have any meetings because nobody would know where to go. And finally, we would set up these. We would set the meeting for the next meeting at each meeting, and then people would show up at somebody's apartment, and we would be discussing scripts or whatever we had to do. And as far as going back to Moscow in 2020, I was absolutely stunned to discover that the studio number 13, where we shot, had never been renovated in all that time. Like, the equipment was new, but the walls were the same. And when I asked the woman, so when I went into the TV station, and when I went in this time, they had all kinds of security, and that wasn't there, earlier. And I understood there were no Americans, walking in and out of the TV station at that time. And they kind of didn't understand why I was there. They didn't believe that I had made Ulica Sezam, which means Sesame Street in Russia, until we went to the studio and they mentioned that there was somebody who worked on the show. And they called this man, Anton, who was like an audio engineer, and they had him on a speakerphone. And they said, there's this American here who, says she worked on Ulica Sezam. This is all in Russian. And he says, is that Natasha Lance? And from then on, their behavior changed completely.
Yes, they turned into pussycats.
Yeah.
Okay, this is one you can answer fairly easily. What kind of response did Ulica Sezam receive in popular social culture in Russia, and how large or small was its viewership?
It was a huge hit across the entire former USSR, and it lasted for 10 years. It aired on Russia's 2 top TV channels simultaneously, which had never happened previously. And my information now is anecdotal, more recently, but when I meet people in Europe and in the States who are from the former Soviet Union, like the Georgian nail salonist who I saw the other day, and they just, they'll often start, when I tell them that I worked on the show, and they'll say, they'll start reciting a song from the show. It's very much like Sesame Street. It was that popular.
So this answers
in the
this question about it
post-USSR
having a
too.
lasting influence. But this questioner did want to know why it was canceled and when it happened. Is this a Putin thing?
It was canceled. It was very hard to get one answer to this question when I was interviewing people for the book. But essentially, as relations with the U.S. and Russia worsened, and Putin was cracking down on independent media, there was a real grab to control a lot of programs, including our program, Sesame Street. And the people in charge, the TV executives, wanted to fire the research director, Russian research director, and replace some of the people because they didn't like perhaps the ideological direction the show was going.
And this leads into this question, which was, were there any particular storylines on the show that caused a reaction from Russian viewers that you didn't expect?
That's a really good question. Not in my tenure, not in the first.
So really no pushback at all after all that.
I mean,
That's amazing.
the show is very Russian. I mean, I
the
have
kids
some
sad
picture
and-
here.
Do they drink vodka?
Not on the show. But the characters, like the Muppet, the blue Muppet character, Zeli Boba.
Oh, you have that picture you can show them.
Oh, yes, thank you. Is here, and his origin story is fascinating because he came out of Russian folklore, and he's based on a domovoi, which is the spirit of the hearth and the home, and he lives in nature. So he became Zeli Boba, and if you look closely at the picture, there's tufts of moss and grass and twigs in his costume. And on the show, he lives inside a 40-foot tree. This is an oak tree, which is so Russian, even down to the oak leaves, which had to have the correct number of points so that it would be consistent with Russian oak leaves. And I'm not kidding, like all of the characters.
You had an art department that I would kill for.
The
I
art,
mean,
yeah.
they were true artists in every sense of the word.
And it was, everything had to be like that. And the only problem is that, at this time in Moscow, they didn't have any bark, or there was no like a scenic design where you could go and order this stuff. So we actually had to transport 60 boxes of bark and leaves and grass to Moscow, by hand.
But not in your bra.
Not in my bra, thank God. I didn't think pretty bad.
Your things are looking
That'd
up.
be dangerous. That'd be painful.
Here's a question I think I know the answer to, but you'll know better than I. Were there other programs being produced on Russian television at this time which were revolutionary?
The answer is no.
Yeah, I had a feeling.
There were later. Later there were,
Uh-huh.
but not at this time. And at this time, there was only one other children's show, Spokojny Noci Malachi, and it was like a 15-minute, very didactic show. And it was a show that kids were shown before they go to bed, which was basically like, watch the show, be obedient, go to bed.
Show us some of these other pictures. We have time. We have a few minutes.
You have time? Okay.
Yeah.
And so this is the male character is Kubik, and he's basically a modern nerd. And he's based on a Russian literary character who's like a ne'er-do-well. So he comes up with ideas. He's very inventive, but he's always inventing things that already exist, like a clothesline. And then Businka, which is the little hand puppet, here is the female Muppet that was created originally for Ulica Sezam. And this was a real discussion because in the book, I go into great detail about the gender discussions because they initially, the team, many people on the team wanted her to be docile and kind of sweet, often similar to characters in Russian literature that are female characters. But the young writers, the female writers, were like, we don't want to do that. We just had this revolution. We want to create a whole new stereotype. We want to we want to counter the stereotypes and create a whole new way of modeling how young girls can be. So they made her very energetic, and she is kind of mischievous, and she dances the lambada. So that was her character.
Is that it? Well, I have one last question for you, which is the corporate parent Sesame Street company had to know virtually all of the things you were going through. Did you feel they were properly appreciative of what you were holding down?
It was, it's a different company now than it was then. The kind of work that Sesame Street is doing as a nonprofit in Syria and all these countries, including creating programming now for Ukrainian children and refugees all over the world, it's very mission-driven and it's incredibly internationally focused. Mm-hmm. But at the time we were working, it was very much focused on the U.S. domestic production, and we were a small unit. So I think there were people that worked with me closely, and they're in the book. They're heroic people who fought, but it wasn't uniformly approved inside the corporation. So I often felt at the time that I was being, that there were enormous obstacles both in Moscow, and there were also obstacles on the corporate side, in the United States. But me personally, I always preferred the obstacles in Moscow. It was easier for me.
Welcome to my world with corporate entertainment company behavior. I know more about that than what you've been through.
I'm sure you do.
Is there anything else, because we have just a couple minutes left, that I haven't asked you about or we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I do want to talk about one thing, which is that, when we decided to hold the auditions for the children, This was just before we started the filming of the Muppets, the Slavic Muppets with the Russian actors in the newly created neighborhood. We had to cast all the children for the show. And I had been looking forward to this moment for months. This is when you hear, sweet soprano voices singing, and I thought this was going to be fabulous. And I get to the auditions, and the director asked me to kind of stay in the back because most of these parents with their children had never met an American before. And they said, why don't you, that might intimidate them a little bit, so just let's not introduce it. And as I sat there, the first little boy comes in, and all the children are performing completely isolated from each other, so they can't hear what the other children are singing. And the first little boy comes in, and he sings this song from Belarusky Vokzal, from a film. And it's a World War II song. And the words are something like, "The planet is burning," "Everything is lost."
I die now happily.
And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, okay, this is really weird for a comedy show audition. But I'm like,
Was he on pitch at least?
He was, and he dropped his voice. He's talking in an octave
my God.
below, sitting, standing upright like this. And then he leaves, and then the next little girl comes in, little blonde with blue eyes, a beautiful girl who then sings this song called Katyusha. And it's kind of this morose World War II song about a woman bidding her lover farewell as he goes off to the front. So the rest of the morning is like this, and I'm just sitting here, dumbstruck.
You're thinking this country needs children's songs.
I'm like, and this was already after dealing with the classical music thing, and so then at lunchtime, I asked the director, and I say to him, "What's going on? What are they singing all this?" I was expecting like Old MacDonald's had a farm or Itsy Bitsy Spider. And he says, "Natasha, you don't understand. You think of these songs as morose. These songs are poetic and lyrical. And these are the songs that bring children comfort. These are the songs that they sang with their grandmothers." And he says, "You shouldn't think of them, as sad songs." And then he says, "Our children read poetry from a very young age, and they expect sadness in their music and in their lives."
The Russian relationship with misery is really like this. And that must have been very hard for you to pry that apart a little bit and let some sun in the crack.
It was, but it was often such an organic process. You ask what kept me there. It was not only the discussions about Kandinsky, but it was also these moments where you have this discussion. And then, several months later, after we tested some of these, serious songs that we had created, and the director was open to changing his mind because in some of these videotaped research studies where we taped the kids and watching the show, the reaction to those songs was not as good as when we had the upbeat music. And in one of them, a little boy picked up a fake pistol as he was watching the lyrical, poetic songs, and he shot the little girl with the braids next to him. So the director was like, "Oh, okay." But then...
Great way to make your point.
But, I will say, Leslie, that, one of the things I think about now that, brings, just gives me such solace. And I thought about this at about 4 o'clock in the morning one night, and this was as I had been watching all these young men and women marching out of Russia.
Yes.
In their they're in their late 20s and early 30s, and they don't want to fight. They don't support the war, and it occurred to me, that's the age cohort that watched Ulitza Sezam.
Yeah.
That's the Ulitza Sezam generation. And then as I was lying in bed, not able to sleep, just, it's been hard with this horrific war and having seen where we were 30 years ago and where we are today. And I realized that in Ukraine as well, that the young people fighting for their independence now, who are the same
They've
cohort,
also
age
seen
cohort,
it.
they are also the Ulitza Sezam generation.
Yes.
So we did make an impact.
Natasha,
Please
that
thank
was fun.
Natasha Lance Rogoff and Leslie Dixon.
All right, we're off.
Thank you.